Document. Part 1 of They Gave Up Hope. Then Earth's Armada broke through the stars. The world was quiet now, quieter than it had ever been. The cities that once buzzed with life were nothing more than broken skeletons of steel and concrete. The streets, once filled with cars and people rushing to their destinations, were empty, except for the wind that carried dust and ash. It wasn't just the silence that weighed heavily on those who remained, was the despair. For over 200 years, humanity had lived under the boot of an alien empire known as the Krylos. These towering beings, with their sleek silver armor and cold, calculating eyes, had come from the stars, not as explorers, but as conquerors. They stripped Earth of its resources, enslaved its people, and left behind only enough scraps for the survivors to cling to life. Daniel Carter sat in the dim light of a flickering lantern, his hands resting on his knees. His face was streaked with dirt, and his dark hair was matted from weeks of living underground. He stared at the cracked screen of an old tablet, trying to make sense of the fragments of data scrolling across it. The device was ancient by modern standards, salvaged from the ruins of what used to be a tech store decades ago. But it still worked, barely, and right now, it was all he had. Beside him, Leela Monroe leaned against the damp wall of the bunker, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her hazel eyes reflected both exhaustion and determination. She was younger than Daniel, maybe in her late 20s, but she carried herself like someone who had seen far too much. "You're wasting your time," Leela said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but firm. "There's nothing out there anymore, Daniel. No one's coming to save us." Daniel didn't look up from the tablet. "I don't believe that," he replied, his tone measured but tinged with frustration. "If they destroyed every last ship, every last base, then why are the Krylos still patrolling the skies? Why do they keep scanning for signals if they think we're done?" Lila sighed and pushed herself off the wall. She walked over to where Daniel sat and crouched down beside him. "Because they're thorough," she said, "and because they know how stubborn humans can be. Look around you, Daniel. We're hiding in holes in the ground while they control everything above us. What makes you think anyone survived out there?" Daniel paused, his fingers hovering over the tablet. He glanced at her, his brown eyes searching hers for a moment before he looked away. "Because I have to believe it," he admitted quietly. "If I stop believing, if I give up, then what's the point of any of this?" Lila didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was simple, but meaningful, reminder that even in their darkest moments, they weren't alone. "I get it," she said after a while, "but hope isn't going to feed us or keep us safe. We need to focus on what we can control." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the narrow tunnel leading into the bunker. Both of them tensed, instinctively reaching for the weapons strapped to their sides. A moment later, Jake Miller appeared, his lanky frame silhouetted by the faint glow of the lantern. Jake was one of the newer members of their group, a man in his early 30s, with sandy blonde hair and a nervous energy that made him seem constantly on edge. He held up his hands when he saw their defensive stances. "Relax. It's just me," he said quickly, his voice wavering slightly. "I brought some supplies back from the surface." Daniel relaxed, but kept his hand near his weapon. "What did you find?" he asked. Jake set down a small backpack and began pulling out items, a few cans of food, a couple of water bottles, and a tattered map. "Not much," he admitted. "Most of the places we usually hit have already been picked clean, but I did hear something interesting while I was out there." Lila raised an eyebrow. "Interesting how?" Jake hesitated, glancing between the two of them. "There's talk among the Krylos patrols," he said slowly. "Some of them mentioned, well, rumors about ships moving in deep space. Human ships." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel leaned forward, his expression sharp. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Did you hear anything specific?" Jake shook his head. Just whispers, really? Nothing concrete? But it got me thinking, if there are ships out there, maybe they're looking for survivors. Maybe they haven't forgotten about us. Lila frowned, clearly skeptical. Or maybe it's a trap, she said. The Krylos aren't exactly known for their honesty. I know, Jake replied defensively. But isn't it worth checking out? If there's even a chance. He's right, Daniel interrupted, cutting off whatever Lila was about. To say even if it's a long shot, we owe it to ourselves and to everyone else to at least try. If there's a way to contact whoever's out there, we need to find it. Lila opened her mouth to argue, but stopped herself. She could see the resolve in Daniel's eyes, the same stubbornness that had driven him to keep fighting when so many others had given up. Finally, she nodded. Fine, she said, but we do this smart. No reckless moves, no unnecessary risks. Agreed. Daniel smiled faintly. Agreed. Over the next few days, the three of them worked tirelessly to piece together any information they could find about potential communication systems. They scoured old databases, repaired broken equipment, and even ventured closer to the surface to eavesdrop on Krylos' transmissions. It was dangerous work, but none of them complained. For the first time in years, there was a spark of hope, a fragile, flickering flame that refused to go out. One evening, as they huddled around the tablet in the bunker, Daniel let out a triumphant shout. Got it, he exclaimed, pointing at the screen. On it was a faint, distorted signal, a series of numbers and letters that didn't make immediate sense. But buried within the code was something unmistakably human. Coordinates. Lila's breath caught in her throat. Do you think it's real? She whispered. I don't know, Daniel admitted, but it's the best lead we've had in years. And if it is real, then maybe we're not as alone as we thought. As they stared at the screen, the weight of centuries of oppression seemed to lift slightly. For the first time in a long time, they allowed themselves to imagine a future where humanity might rise again, not as victims, but as survivors. End of document. The faint signal Daniel had uncovered was both a blessing and a curse. It offered hope, but it also demanded action that came with risks none of them could ignore. The coordinates embedded in the transmission pointed to a location deep in space, far beyond the reach of anything they could verify. Yet, the mere possibility that it might lead them to Alazor, even salvation, was enough to push Daniel and Lila forward. They couldn't afford to waste time questioning its authenticity. Every second spent doubting was a second wasted. We need to send a response, Daniel said firmly as he stared at the tablet. His voice carried a mix of urgency and determination. If someone's out there listening, we have to let them know we're still alive. Lila crossed her arms over her chest, her expression skeptical. And if it's a trap, she countered. What if the Krylos are monitoring these frequencies? We could be leading them straight to us. Daniel glanced up at her, his jaw tightening. He knew she was right too. Could be a trap. But what choice did they have? Sitting in the bunker waiting for death wasn't much of an option either. We'll take precautions, he said after a moment. Encrypt the message. Keep it short. Just enough to confirm we're human and we need help. Jake, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, leaned forward. How do you even encrypt something like this? He asked nervously. I mean, we don't exactly have top-of-the-line tech here. Lila sighed and grabbed the tablet from Daniel. She began typing quickly, her fingers moving with practiced precision. It's not perfect, but I can scramble the signal enough to make it hard for the Krylos to trace, she explained. Even if they intercept it, they won't know where it came from, unless they crack the code, and that'll buy us some time. Daniel nodded approvingly. Good, do it. For the next several hours, the three of them worked together, fine-tuning the message until it was ready. When they were done, the transmission read simply, "This is Earth. Coordinates received. Are you friendly? Awaiting contact?" Short, clear, and impossible to mistake for anything other than human communication. But sending the message wasn't as simple as pressing a button. Their current equipment wasn't powerful enough to broadcast into deep space. To increase their chances of reaching whoever or whatever was on the other end, they needed access to a stronger transmitter, and that meant leaving the relative safety of the bunker. "There's an old relay station outside the city," Jake suggested hesitantly. "Used to be part of the global network before the invasion. If any of it's still operational, it might work." "Still operational," Lila repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You realize how long it's been since anyone maintained those stations, right?" "It's our best shot," Daniel interjected. "We don't have another option." Reluctantly, Lila agreed. Early the next morning, they packed what little supplies they had and set out toward the ruins of Chicago, where the relay station was located. The journey was perilous from the start. The air above them buzzed with Krylos drones, patrolling the skies like mechanical vultures. Every step felt like walking through a minefield, each movement calculated to avoid detection as they moved cautiously through the desolate streets. Daniel couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. This had once been a thriving city, full of life and energy. Now, it was a graveyard of crumbling buildings and shattered dreams. Overgrown weeds sprouted through cracks in the pavement, and rusting cars sat abandoned like tombstones. The only sounds were the distant hum of alien machinery and the occasional creak of metal shifting in the wind. Midway through their trek, they encountered their first major obstacle, a checkpoint manned by Krylos soldiers. The towering aliens stood guard near a makeshift barricade, their weapons gleaming under the pale sunlight. There was no way around it. They would have to find a way through. "We can't fight them," Lila whispered urgently as they hid behind the wreckage of an overturned truck. "There's too many of them." "No kidding," Jake muttered under his breath, his hands trembling slightly. Daniel scanned the area, his mind racing. Then he noticed something: a narrow alleyway partially blocked by debris. It wasn't ideal, but it might give them cover long enough to slip past unnoticed. "Follow me," he said quietly. "Stay low and stay quiet." One by one, they crept through the alley, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of the Krylos language grew louder as they neared the end of the passage. For a brief moment, Daniel thought they'd been spotted when one of the soldiers turned his head in their direction. But just as quickly, the alien dismissed the movement as nothing more than the wind. When they finally emerged on the other side, all three of them exhaled in relief. "That was too close," Jake whispered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Too close isn't good enough," Leela snapped, though her tone lacked real anger. She was just as shaken as the rest of them. By nightfall, they reached the outskirts of the relay station. The structure itself was a hulking mass of antennas and satellite dishes, most of which were either damaged or completely destroyed. But nestled within the chaos was a small control room, its windows boarded up and its door hanging off its hinges. Inside, they found rows of dusty consoles and flickering monitors, remnants of a world long gone. "This is it," Daniel said, running, his hand over one of the panels. "Let's see if we can get it working." For the next few hours, they worked tirelessly to repair the equipment. Leela handled the wiring, her steady hands weaving new connections into the ancient machinery. Jake scoured the room for spare parts, bringing back anything that looked remotely useful. Meanwhile, Daniel focused on powering up the main console, coaxing it back to life with a combination of brute force and sheer willpower. Finally, just as dawn began to break, the system sputtered to life. The screens lit up with static, and the hum of electricity filled the room. "We're live," Daniel announced, his voice tinged with triumph. Leela uploaded the encrypted message onto the system and initiated the transmission. As the data streamed outward, a sense of anticipation settled over the group. None of them spoke. They simply watched as the signal disappeared into the void, carrying their fragile hopes with it. Hours passed without a response. Doubt started creeping in again, whispering cruel truths about the futility of their efforts. Jake paced anxiously, muttering under his breath. Leela busied herself, checking and rechecking the equipment, as if willing it to produce a miracle. Daniel remained seated at the console, his eyes fixed on the screen, refusing to give up. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the monitor flickered. A new signal appeared, weak but unmistakable. It was garbled at first, fragments of words and numbers flashing across the screen. Slowly, painstakingly, Lila managed to decode it. It's a reply, she said, her voice trembling with disbelief. They're human. They say they're coming. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He turned to look at Leela, then at Jake, who looked like he might collapse from shock. Did they say when? He asked hoarsely. Leela shook her head. No specifics. Just that reinforcements are on the way. For a moment, none of them moved. The weight of the news was almost too much to process. After years of despair, of believing they were utterly alone, they now had proof that humanity still existed beyond Earth's borders. Somewhere out there, people were fighting for them, for all of them. But as quickly as the joy came, reality set in. We can't stay here, Lila said sharply, snapping everyone out of their daze. If the Krylos detect this transmission, they'll swarm this place. We need to move, now. Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. She's right. Pack up what we can, and head back to the bunker. We'll regroup and figure out our next move. As they left the relay station behind, the night sky stretched endlessly above them, vast and unknowable. For the first time in what felt like forever, it didn't seem so empty. Somewhere out there, ships were flying toward Earth, carrying the promise of salvation. All they had to do was survive long enough to meet them. The journey back to the bunker was fraught with tension. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of their newfound hope was pressing down on them. The message they had sent and the reply they received had changed everything. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of something beyond survival. But that glimmer came with risks, and none of them could shake the feeling that danger was closing in. As they trudged through the darkened streets of what was once Chicago, Daniel kept scanning the skies. The Krylos drones were more active now, their glowing red eyes sweeping over the ruins like predatory birds searching for prey. We need to stay off the main roads, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of distant engines. If they spot us, we're done. Lila nodded, her grip tightening on the rifle slung across her shoulder. She glanced at Jake, who lagged behind, his face pale and streaked with sweat. He hadn't said much since they left the relay station, and his silence worried her. Keep up, Jake, she urged softly. We can't afford to slow down. Jake forced a weak smile, but didn't respond. His hands trembled as he adjusted the strap of his backpack, which contained some of the spare parts they'd scavenged from the station. He wasn't built for this kind of life, none of them were, but Jake seemed particularly ill-suited for it. Still, he pressed on, his footsteps uneven but determined. The group made their way through narrow alleys and crumbling buildings, avoiding open spaces wherever possible. They moved cautiously, pausing every few minutes to listen for signs of pursuit. So far, they hadn't encountered any Krylos patrols, but the absence of confrontation only heightened their unease. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like hours, they reached the edge of the industrial district, where the remains of old factories loomed like skeletal giants against the horizon. This area was less patrolled by the Krylos, likely because there was nothing left worth guarding. Most of the structures had collapsed long ago, leaving behind jagged piles of metal and concrete. It was treacherous terrain, but it offered chance to slip away unnoticed. Let's take a break here, Daniel said finally, gesturing toward the shadow of a half-collapsed warehouse. We've been moving non-stop since we left the station. We're no good to anyone if we collapse from exhaustion. Lila didn't argue. She slid down against the wall, letting out a shaky breath as she rested her head on her knees. Her body ached from the strain of the journey, and her mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. What would they do when the Armada arrived? How would they prepare for an invasion that could turn the tide of the war or crush them completely? Jake dropped his bag beside her and sank to the ground, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the clasp of his water bottle. Do you think they'll really come?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel crouched down next to him, his expression serious but reassuring. "They said they're coming," he replied firmly. "That's enough. For me." But what if Jake started, then stopped himself? He looked down at his hands, his knuckles white from gripping the bottle too tightly. What if they don't make it in time? Lila exchanged a glance with Daniel before speaking. "We focus on what we can control," she said. "Right now, that means getting back to the bunker and figuring out how to hold out until help arrives. We can't afford to second-guess every decision." Jake nodded slowly, though his eyes still held a flicker of doubt. He wanted to believe, just like the rest of them, but the years of oppression had worn him down. Trusting in salvation felt like stepping onto thin ice. It might hold, or it might crack beneath their feet. They stayed in the shadows of the warehouse for only a few minutes before continuing their trek. The closer they got to the outskirts of the city, the quieter it became. The constant hum of alien machinery faded into the background, replaced by the eerie silence of abandonment. Even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb the stillness. It was during this stretch of the journey that disaster struck. They were crossing an open field when a sharp whine cut through the air. Before any of them could react, a bolt of blue plasma shot past them, striking the ground just a few feet away. Dirt and debris exploded upward, showering them with fragments of earth. "Get down," Daniel shouted, diving behind a pile of rubble. Lila and Jake followed suit, scrambling for cover as another blast tore through the air. From the edge of the field, a squad of Krylos soldiers emerged, their sleek armor glinting under the moonlight. Their weapons were raised, targeting the trio with deadly precision. One of them barked an order in their guttural language, and the others spread out, forming a semicircle around their position. "How did they find us?" Lila hissed, her voice tight with panic, as she peered over the rubble. There was no way the Krylos could have traced the signals so quickly. It had to be something else. Daniel's jaw tightened as realization dawned on him. "Jake," he said sharply, turning to look at the younger man. "Did you tell anyone about the relay station?" Jake froze, his face going pale. I didn't mean to," he stammered. "One of the other guys in the bunker," he asked. "Me, where we were going. I thought it was okay." "You thought it was okay," Lila snapped, her voice rising despite the danger. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I'm sorry," Jake cried, tears welling up in his eyes. "I didn't think they'd—" "There's no time for apologies," Daniel interrupted, cutting him off. "We need to move. Now." The Krylos were advancing steadily, their weapons trained on the group. Another plasma bolt struck the ground near them, forcing them to duck lower. They were pinned down, with no clear path to escape. "We can't fight them," Lila said urgently. "There's too many." "I know," Daniel replied, his mind racing. Then he spotted something, a drainage pipe running along the edge of the field, partially hidden by weeds. It was narrow, and probably led to nowhere useful, but it might give them a chance to slip away unnoticed. "Follow me," he said, pointing toward the pipe. Without waiting for a response, he darted toward the opening, staying low to avoid drawing fire. Lila hesitated for a moment before following, dragging Jake along with her. The three of them crawled into the pipe, the sound of Krylos' weapons echoing behind them. Inside, the space was cramped and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew. They moved as quickly as they could, their progress slowed by the tight quarters and uneven ground. Behind them, They could hear the aliens shouting orders, their boots thudding against the earth as they searched for their quarry. "They're going to find us," Jake whimpered, his voice trembling. "They always find us." "Not this time," Daniel said firmly. "Keep moving." The pipe twisted and turned, leading them deeper underground. At one point, it split into two paths, forcing them to choose blindly. Daniel went left, trusting his instincts. Minutes later, they emerged into a larger tunnel, dimly lit by cracks in the ceiling above. "This leads to the bunker," Lila said, recognizing the route. "If we can make it there, we can lock it down." But even as she spoke, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the tunnel. The Krylos had found the entrance to the pipe. "Run!" Daniel shouted. They sprinted down the tunnel, their legs burning with effort. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Just as they rounded a corner, a plasma bolt seared past them, narrowly, missing Daniel's shoulder. "We're not going to make it," Jake yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "Yes, we are," Lila snapped, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. "Move." Finally, they reached the ladder leading up to the bunker. Daniel climbed first, pushing open the hatch and scrambling inside. Lila helped Jake up, then pulled herself through just as the first Krylos soldier appeared at the base of the ladder. "Seal it," Daniel ordered, slamming the hatch shut and locking it in place. A moment later, the sound of fists pounding against the metal echoed through the room. For a few seconds, they simply stood there, breathing heavily, their hearts racing. Then Lila turned to Jake, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "What were you thinking?" she demanded. "Do you realize what you've put us all through?" Jake hung his head, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." "Sorry isn't going to cut it," Daniel interjected, his voice cold. "You betrayed us, Jake. If those coordinates get back to the Krylos, we're finished." Jake flinched at the accusation, but didn't deny it. He knew he had messed up, and there was no excuse for it. Lila sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We don't have time to deal with this now," she said. "The Krylos will figure out how to get in eventually. We need to reinforce the bunker and prepare for the worst." Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "Agreed. Let's get to work." As they began fortifying the bunker, the reality of their situation sank in. They had survived for now, but the cost of Jake's mistake weighed heavily on all of them. The message they had sent was their only lifeline, and if the Krylos intercepted it, their fragile hope would be extinguished forever. Yet, amid the chaos and fear, Daniel allowed himself a moment of quiet determination. Help was coming. He didn't know when or how, but he refused to give up. Humanity had endured centuries of suffering, and they weren't going to let the Krylos win, not now, not ever. Available Hand was busy reinforcing the walls, setting traps, and organizing supplies. The sound of hammers pounding nails echoed through the narrow tunnels, mingling with the tense voices of the rebels as they prepared for what might come next. Daniel moved quickly, his mind racing as he coordinated the efforts. He knew time was not on their side. If the Krylos managed to break through, and they almost certainly would, they needed to be ready. Lila worked beside him, her hands steady, despite the chaos swirling around them. She had taken charge of medical supplies, ensuring that bandages, antiseptics, and painkillers were organized and accessible. Her focus didn't waver, even when she caught sight of Jake sitting in a corner, his head buried in his hands. Guilt radiated from him like heat, but Lila forced herself not to look at him for too long. There was no room for pity right now. They all had jobs to do. "We need to block off the main entrance," Daniel said, addressing a small group of rebels who had gathered near the hatch. "Stack whatever you can find, metal sheets, crates, anything heavy enough to slow them down." One of the rebels, a wiry man named Ethan, nodded and gestured for others to follow him. "Got it?" he replied. "We'll make sure they don't walk in here without a fight." As the group dispersed, Daniel turned to Lila. "How are we doing on supplies?" he asked. Better than expected, she answered, wiping sweat from her forehead. We've got enough food and water to last a week, maybe 2 if we ration carefully. But medicine is still a problem. We're low on antibiotics, and if anyone gets seriously injured. She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what she meant. Without proper medical care, even minor wounds could become life-threatening. And given the likelihood of a violent confrontation with the Krylos, injuries were inevitable. Daniel clenched his jaw, but nodded. Do what you can, he said. And keep an eye on Jake. I don't trust him alone right now. Leela glanced over at Jake again. He hadn't moved from his spot in the corner, though his shoulders shook slightly as if he were crying. She hesitated. Before responding, he messed up bad, she admitted. But punishing him isn't going to help us survive. Let me talk to him. Daniel considered this for a moment, then gave a reluctant nod. Fine, just make sure he doesn't do anything stupid. While Leela approached Jake, Daniel climbed up to the upper level of the bunker, where a makeshift communications station had been set up. It wasn't much, a few salvaged monitors, and a tangle of wires, but it was their only link to the outside world. He sat down and began scanning the frequencies, listening for any sign of the mysterious signal they had received earlier. So far, there was nothing but static. Hours passed, and the tension in the bunker grew thicker. The pounding on the hatch above had stopped, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the Krylos found another way in. Some of the rebels suggested abandoning the bunker altogether and retreating deeper underground, but Daniel rejected the idea. Running wouldn't solve anything. It would only delay the inevitable. They needed to stand their ground and hold out until help arrived or until it became clear that help wasn't coming. Late in the evening, Leela joined Daniel at the communications station. She carried 2 cups of lukewarm water, offering one to him wordlessly. He accepted it gratefully, taking a sip before speaking. How's Jake? He asked. He's broken, Leela replied after a pause. He knows he screwed up, and he's terrified. But fear doesn't excuse betrayal. Daniel, what happens if the Krylos figure out about the message? What if they intercept it? Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. I don't know, he admitted, but we can't undo what's been done. All we can do is prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Lila nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the flickering screen in front of them. Do you really think they'll come? She asked softly. The Armada, I mean. Daniel hesitated before answering. He wanted to say yes, to reassure her that everything would be okay, but lying wouldn't help either of them. Instead, he chose his words carefully. I don't know, he said finally, but I have to believe they will. If I stop believing, then what's the point of all this? Lila didn't respond immediately. She simply watched the screens, her expression unreadable. Then, just as Daniel was about to turn back to his work, something changed. A faint crackle broke through the static, followed by a series of tones that sounded almost melodic. What was that? Lila asked, leaning closer. I don't know, Daniel replied, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he adjusted the frequency. The signal grew stronger, clearer. Words began to form on the screen, fragmented but intelligible. Message received. The text read, coordinates confirmed. Fleet en route. Estimated arrival 3 weeks. Both of them froze, staring at the screen in stunned silence. For a moment, neither of them dared to speak. Then Leela let out a shaky laugh, tears welling up in her eyes. They're coming, she whispered. They're actually coming. Daniel felt a surge of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years' hope. It wasn't blind optimism. It was tempered by the knowledge that 3 weeks was a long time, especially under siege. But it was something tangible, something real. Humanity wasn't alone. Somewhere out there, ships were flying toward Earth, carrying the promise of salvation. We need to tell the others, Lila said, standing up abruptly. Everyone needs to hear this. Daniel nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead. 3 weeks meant they had to survive until then. That meant holding off the Krylos, conserving their resources, and keeping morale intact. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. As Lila hurried off to share the news, Daniel stayed behind, staring at the screen. The message continued to play, repeating the same information over and over. He memorized every word, committing it to memory in case the signal disappeared. Finally, he reached for the tablet and jotted down the key details: the estimated arrival time, the size of the fleet, and the name of the admiral leading the mission, a woman named Rachel Hayes. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, heavier than ever. These people were counting on him, not just the rebels in the bunker, but everyone on Earth. If they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic, but failure wasn't an option. Not anymore. By morning, the entire bunker knew about the message. The atmosphere had shifted noticeably. There was still fear, but it was mixed with a renewed sense of purpose. People worked harder, faster, driven by the knowledge that help was on the way. Even Jake seemed to have regained some semblance of determination, though he kept to himself and avoided meeting anyone's eyes. Daniel called a meeting in the main chamber of the bunker, gathering everyone together to discuss their strategy. Standing on a makeshift platform, he addressed the group, his voice steady and firm. "We've got 3 weeks," he began. 3 weeks until the fleet arrives. In that time, we need to hold this bunker, no matter what. The Krylos will come, for us, and when they do, we need to be ready. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but no one argued. They trusted Daniel to lead them, even if the odds were stacked against them. "We'll fortify the entrances, set traps, and rotate watch shifts," he continued. "Food and water will be rationed, and anyone who's injured needs to report to Leela immediately. This isn't just about staying alive, it's about giving the fleet a fighting chance when they get here." Ethan raised his hand, drawing Daniel's attention. "What happens if the Krylos find out about the message?" he asked. "What if they try to intercept the fleet?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "We don't know how much they know," he admitted, "but we can't assume they're unaware. That's why we need to sabotage as many of their systems as we can before the fleet arrives. Cut off their communications, disable their weapons, anything to weaken their defenses." The plan was risky, but it was all they had. Over the next few days, teams were organized to carry out targeted attacks on nearby Krylos installations. Daniel insisted on leading one of the missions himself, despite Leela's protests. "You're our leader," she argued. "If something happens to you, we lose everything. And if I stay here while others risk their lives, I'm not much of a leader," Daniel countered. "Besides, I'm the best person for the job. You know it." Reluctantly, Lila agreed. She focused instead on preparing medical kits and training volunteers to assist her in treating injuries. Meanwhile, Jake volunteered to help with logistics, using his knowledge of engineering to repair damaged equipment and improve the bunker's defenses. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. As the days passed, the bunker became a fortress. Traps lined the tunnels, weapons were distributed, and emergency plans were drilled into everyone's minds. Morale remained fragile, but the shared goal of survival kept them united. Then, during the second week, disaster struck. A massive explosion rocked the bunker, sending debris flying and knocking several people off their feet. The blast came from one of the outer walls, where the Krylos had breached the structure. Shouts of panic filled the air as dust and smoke billowed through the tunnels. "They're inside," someone screamed. Daniel grabbed his rifle and sprinted toward the breach, shouting orders as he went. "Fall back to the inner chambers. Seal off the tunnels." The rebels scrambled to obey, retreating deeper into the bunker, while a small team held the line against the invaders. Plasma bolts flew in. The decision to leave the bunker was not made lightly. It was a desperate move, born out of necessity rather than strategy. The Krylos had breached their defenses, and staying put meant certain death. Every member of the group understood this, even if the thought of venturing back into open territory filled them with dread. The bunker had been their sanctuary, however fragile it was. Now, they were being forced to abandon it. Daniel gathered everyone in the innermost chamber, where the air was thick with tension and exhaustion. Faces were streaked with dirt and sweat, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. Some were injured, their bandages stained red. Despite the grim circumstances, there was a glimmer of resolve in their expressions. They had survived the initial attack, and that alone gave them a sliver of confidence. "We're moving out at first light," Daniel announced, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was asking them to do. "We can't stay here. The Krylos will be back, and next time, they'll bring more firepower." A murmur rippled through the group. Ethan raised his hand hesitantly. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Out there isn't exactly safe either." Daniel nodded, acknowledging the truth in Ethan's words. "We're heading for the old energy plant," he replied. "It's about 20 miles east of here. If we can disable it, we'll cut off power to one of their major shield networks. That'll weaken their orbital defenses and give the fleet a better chance when they arrive." Leela stepped forward, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. 20 miles is a long way," she said, her tone measured but firm, "especially with wounded people and limited supplies. And you know the Krylos will be watching every step we take." "I know," Daniel admitted, "but it's our best shot. If we can pull this off, we might actually make a difference. We can't just sit around waiting for the fleet to save us. We need to fight back." No one argued. They all knew the risks, but they also understood that doing nothing would lead to the same outcome as failure. At least this way, they had a purpose. One by one, they began preparing for the journey ahead, packing what little food and water they had left, gathering weapons, and tending to injuries as best they could. By dawn, the group was ready to move. The sky above them was overcast, the gray clouds casting a pale light over the ruins of the city. The air was cold, biting at exposed skin, but no one complained. They moved quickly and quietly, sticking to the shadows as much as possible, every sound a distant hum of machinery. The creak of metal shifting in the wind set their nerves on edge. Jake walked near the back of the group, his head down and his hands clutching the strap of his backpack. He hadn't spoken much since the attack on the bunker, and guilt still clung to him like a second skin. He wanted to prove himself, to show that he wasn't just a burden, but fear held him back. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to keep him from moving forward. Lila noticed his struggle and slowed her pace until she was walking beside him. "You okay?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible, over the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Jake shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I don't know," he admitted. I feel like I'm dragging everyone down." "You've made mistakes," Leela said bluntly. "Big ones. But so has everyone here. What matters now is what you do next." Her words weren't comforting, exactly, but they carried a kind of honesty that Jake needed to hear. He nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "I'll try," he said. "I'll do better." "That's all anyone can ask for," Leela replied before, quickening her pace to catch up with Daniel at the front of the group. The journey to the energy plant was grueling. The terrain was rough, littered with debris and obstacles that forced them to take longer, more circuitous routes. Several times, they had to double back or change direction entirely to avoid Krylos patrols. The constant threat of discovery kept everyone on edge, their senses heightened to the point of exhaustion. On the third day, they reached the outskirts of an industrial zone. The energy plant loomed in the distance, its towering structures surrounded by a maze of fences and guard posts. Even from afar, they could see the glow of plasma cannons mounted along the perimeter, their blue lights pulsing ominously. "This is it," Daniel said. crouching behind a pile of rubble as he studied the layout through binoculars. Looks like they've got heavy defenses, but most of the guards seem to be concentrated at the main gate. If we can find another way in, we'll need a distraction, Lila interjected. Something to draw their attention away from the weak points. Ethan nodded in agreement. Leave that to me, he said. I'll create some noise near the front. Should buy you enough time to slip inside. Daniel hesitated, torn between gratitude and concern. You're sure about this? He asked. It's dangerous. Ethan grinned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Danger's kind of my thing these days, he quipped. Besides, someone's gotta do it. With the plan set, the group split into 2 teams. Ethan and a few others stayed behind to prepare the distraction, while Daniel, Leela, Jake, and the rest moved toward a secondary entrance on the far side of the compound. The wait was agonizing, each passing minute stretching into eternity. Finally, the sound of explosions echoed in the distance, followed by the unmistakable whine of plasma fire. That's our cue, Daniel whispered, signaling for the others to follow him. They moved swiftly, slipping through gaps in the fence and darting between buildings. The area was eerily quiet, the guards seemingly drawn away by the commotion at the main gate. Still, they remained cautious, knowing that even a single mistake could cost them everything. Reaching the control room took longer than expected. The corridors inside the plant were narrow and dimly lit, forcing them to navigate carefully to avoid triggering alarms. Along the way, they encountered a handful of Krylos soldiers, but Daniel and Lila managed to dispatch them quietly, using knives and silenced pistols to minimize noise. When they finally reached the control room, Jake froze in the doorway, staring at the array of blinking monitors and switches. What do we do now? He asked, his voice trembling. Start shutting it down, Daniel instructed, pointing to a series of labeled panels. Lila covered the door. Jake, you're with me. We'll handle the main console. Jake hesitated for a moment before nodding and stepping forward. His hands shook as he worked, but he focused intently, following Daniel's instructions to the letter. Slowly, the hum of machinery began to fade, replaced by the ominous silence of systems powering down. It's working, Lila said from her position by the door. Keep going, but their success came at a price. The sudden loss of power alerted the remaining Krylos forces, who converged on their location with alarming speed. Plasma bolts tore through the walls, forcing them to take cover behind overturned desks and shattered equipment. We're not going to hold them off forever, Lila shouted, firing blindly into the corridor. Just a little longer, Daniel yelled back, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he input the final commands. Almost done. Jake huddled beside him, his face pale but determined. For the first time since joining the group, he felt useful, like he was contributing something meaningful. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Finally, with a loud crackle, the entire system went dark. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into shadow. Outside, the glow of the shield network faded, leaving the sky above unobstructed. We did it. Daniel breathed, leaning back against the wall. Now let's get out of here. As they regrouped with Ethan and the others outside the plant, the reality of their accomplishment began to sink in. They had struck a significant blow against the Krylos, weakening their defenses and giving the approaching fleet a fighting chance. But the victory was bittersweet. Several members of their group had been lost during the mission, including Ethan, whose sacrifice had made the operation possible. Standing amidst the wreckage, Daniel looked at the faces of those who remained. They were tired, battered, and grieving, but they were still standing. Against all odds, they had fought back and won. 1 week, he said, his voice firm, despite the ache in his chest. 1 more week, and help will be here. Let's make sure we're ready. As they prepared to move again, the horizon seemed a little brighter, the stars a little closer. Somewhere beyond the darkness, Ships were flying toward them, carrying the promise of salvation. All they had to do was hold on.